Okay, so we are on to our third approach in psychology now, one that emerged in the 1950s in America, and it came in response really to Freud and behaviorism, the two waves or the two paradigms that came before it. There was a growing group of psychologists, and they rejected Freud's negative focus on the deterministic nature of behaviour and on mental illness. Abraham Maslow, the man you see here, is one of the major figures in the humanistic movement, and he said, "It is as if Freud supplied us the sick half of psychology, and we must now fill it with the healthy half." So the humanistic approach was entirely positive and looked at humans as unique and wanted to study psychology in a more positive, holistic way. The humanistic approach was also proposed in response to the reductionist nature of the behaviourist approach that came before it. The humanists didn't believe that behaviour could be explained in terms of simple stimulus and response relationships like we see in classical and operant conditioning. They rejected the idea that humans are the same as animals. And so you'll see two key figures on this slide. One is Abraham Maslow, which some of you, if you've studied business studies before, may have come across some of his ideas. And at the top we see Carl Rogers, also very, very influential, particularly in the world of clinical psychology. So the specification, the things that you need to know, there are a couple of key terms here. We'll be looking at the concept of free will and its opposition to determinism, self-actualization and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, focus on the self, congruence, the role of conditions of worth, and the influence on counselling psychology. So we're looking at the humanistic approach quite broadly, and then we'll focus on a few of these key areas. So our learning checklist, ensuring that you can identify and answer all of these items. But let's start with the overall key assumptions of the humanistic approach. The humanists believe that we have free will over our behaviour. So they reject the determinism of the psychodynamic and behaviourist approaches, and instead the humanists claim that we are self-determining, which we will explore on the next slide. The humanistic approach believes that each person seeks to grow psychologically and achieve self-actualization by progressing up Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So again, this is an entirely positive way of explaining human behaviour, that we are all trying and striving to just grow psychologically and to be our best selves. The humanistic approach, particularly the work of Rogers, emphasises personal worth and the self, and says that in order to grow and achieve and be the best that we can be, we have to achieve congruence. We have to close the gap between how we see ourselves and who we want to be. We want them to be equal. We want to achieve congruence so that we can be psychologically healthy. The humanists believe that conditions of worth can help prevent personal growth. So conditions that are placed upon the child, they must be X or they must achieve Y in order to receive love and respect from parents or others. If there are conditions on love and worth, then that could be stored up and cause problems later on. And then this led to the idea of client-centered therapy or person-centered therapy, which is the counselling technique that the humanistic approach created, again based on the work of Carl Rogers. The idea here is that therapists should, instead of providing the solutions and being the expert that gives advice to their clients, they should just be there to help facilitate the client to achieve and create solutions for themselves. The client is the expert on their own condition, and so the therapist is really just there to help them achieve all that they can themselves. Remember that we're emphasising free will here. So these are the key assumptions of the humanistic approach, which we will be diving into in more detail. So let's start with the key assumption here of the humanistic approach, and that is that all humans have free will. Free will is the notion that humans can make choices and are not determined by internal or external forces. In other words, we are self-determining. And this is in direct contrast to the psychodynamic approach, which suggests our behaviour is determined by our unconscious. Remember, the psychodynamic approach is psychic determinism. It also rejects the behaviourists, who suggest that behaviour is determined by stimulus-response associations. Now, the humanists don't deny that people are affected by external or internal influences. We are affected by them, but we are still active agents. They believe that we still have the ability to determine our own development. And this is central to the humanistic approach. So let's introduce Abraham Maslow, one of the key figures behind the humanistic movement. Maslow believed that humans are motivated by needs beyond those of basic biological survival. And so simply beyond trying to get food, water, and shelter to survive, actually we are motivated by greater needs. And he thought at the core of human nature is the desire to grow psychologically, the desire to fulfill one's full potential, which is a notion he called self-actualization. Now, there are many, many different definitions of self-actualization, and because the humanists are fiercely anti-science, they actually reject any attempt to study humans in any scientific way. So Maslow wasn't particularly interested in defining and operationalizing self-actualization too closely. He was kind of happy for the individual to define it in their own personal way. But perhaps the best way that we can think of self-actualization is just becoming all that we are capable of, fulfilling one's full potential. And I think that's quite sort of a beautiful notion, I guess, that becoming all that we are capable of is unique to the person themselves. Abraham is perhaps quite or most famous for his hierarchy of needs, which basically says that in order for us to achieve self-actualization, which we see here at the top, in order to fulfill our full potential and become our best selves, we need to ensure that other needs are met. So according to Maslow, our most basic needs are physiological needs, such as breathing and food and water. If these needs are not met, we cannot hope to become all that we are capable of. We can't hope to self-actualize. We need safety and security at the next level of the hierarchy. We need to be physically protected from harm. We need to ensure that we have shelter, we have somewhere to live, and we have resources that could be in the form of money, for example, just to allow us to fulfill those physiological needs. Next up the hierarchy, we need love and belonging. Friendship and family are important. Moving up the hierarchy, we also must ensure that our esteem needs are met. And that means that we have good self-esteem, we have confidence, and we're respected by other people. Maslow referred to these needs as deficiency needs, meaning that in order for us to progress up the hierarchy and in order for us to achieve self-actualization, these needs must be met. So rather than growing, actually we have to kind of fill these in. Okay? He thought that the lower down the hierarchy, the more important that need is and the more difficult it is to ignore. For example, if you don't have enough food, if you're not getting enough sleep, if those basic physiological needs are not being met, then there's no possibility of you achieving self-actualization and fulfilling your creative and moral potential. And so the lower down the need, the more basic it is, the more difficult it is to ignore. So at this point in the video, I'd like you to use this prompt. Imagine you're a teacher and you want to help your pupils to achieve self-actualization. As a teacher, what do you need to do in order to encourage your pupils to be all that they can be? Now, I mentioned a moment ago that self-actualization is intentionally a bit of a vague construct. It's not meant to be operationalized. It's really meant to be totally unique to the individual. But if you wanted to see how self-actualized you were, you could complete this characteristics of self-actualization scale. The link is there and I'll post it in the Firefly task for you as well. So, the only really way that we can get a sense of somebody's subjective feeling of self-actualization is to ask them. And that's why humanists really like questionnaires and self-reports. So this is one questionnaire that's been created to measure self-actualization. So these are some questions that you have to answer using a Likert scale. For example, I often feel gratitude for the good in my life no matter how many times I encounter it. And you can measure that on a 5-part Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Peak experiences, I think, is a fun one. Humanitarianism is a fun one. moral intuition. So there's lots of different elements of self-actualization. I'd really encourage you to take the test yourself online. Okay, so that was Maslow. Maslow, a key person, key figure in the humanistic approach to psychology. Carl Rogers, he's another key figure in humanism, and he's something of a heroic figure in terms of counselling psychology. Rogers argued that for personal growth to be achieved, an individual's self-concept must be equivalent to their ideal self. We're going to look at these terms in a little bit more detail in a moment. He really thought that each client, notice that we're saying client and not patient here, notice the positive spin on that. He said that for each client has within him or herself the vast resources for self-understanding, for altering his or her self-concept, attitudes, and self-directed behaviour. He really saw the best in people, and he thought within each of us is the desire to grow and the answers that we need in order to do so. He once described the human tendency to grow as similar to a potato growing in a dark basement. He had observed this as a child, and he was just astounded. You know, despite the unfavourable conditions that the potato was growing in, a potato still puts out shoots and grows towards the light. Okay, maybe they won't thrive, but they still try their best. And he really likened this to humans who, even in the most unfavourable circumstances, still have this innate tendency to grow. And I think that's a really, really nice metaphor. And that was really the foundation of his person-centered therapy. So let's take a look at conditions of worth, because I think to understand what he meant by self and congruence, we need to understand what these are. And this is a sort of a useful little comic to kind of understand what conditions of worth are. Just remember, son, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose unless you want daddy's love. Unless. That's a condition, right? This is all conditional. Love is conditional on that child winning. And conditions of worth is exactly this. Conditions of worth are conditions that we believe we have to meet in order to gain acceptance, love, or just positive regard from others. So a parent who sets boundaries on the child, you know, I will only love you if, I will only respect you when. A parent who sets those boundaries is setting the child up for psychological problems in later life. A parent that will only show respect and love when the child gets straight A's in school, or wins their football match, or does dancing because the mother did dancing when she was young. All of these are examples of conditions of worth. The child will only feel worthy if X. The child only feels loved if Y. And these boundaries, these conditions, they could lead to psychological problems for that child in the future. So this brings us on to the concept of the self, or the self-concept that Rogers described. This is essentially just how we view ourselves. Rogers proposed that the self-concept, or the self, is developed in childhood, and it really stems from our personal experiences of the world. For example, that could be test results, that could be accolades we receive, it could be compliments or criticisms. Evaluations from other significant people, particularly parents, but also teachers and friends as well. And these conditions of worth, these conditions that a child feels they must meet in order to be loved and respected, all of these help to create our self-concept, how we see ourselves. Rogers believed that the closer our self-concept is, so the closer our self-perception is to the person that we want to be, our ideal self, the greater our feelings of self-worth. So this consistency between our self and our ideal self is known as congruence. Here we can see the self is very, very similar to, is consistent with the ideal self. I want to be happy, and I am happy. I want to be confident, and I am confident. There's consistency here. So that is demonstrating congruence. And greater consistency or greater congruence leads to better feelings of self-worth. If there is a gap, we can see here, between ourself, how we perceive ourselves, and our ideal self, who we want to be, then this gap, this incongruence, can lead to low self-worth and maladjustment. This could lead to psychological issues and inability to cope. And this congruence or incongruence can be measured using a self-report known as the Q-SORT assessment for congruence. Here is a mini version of the Q-SORT assessment, but I'll provide a link and you can take the full congruence Q-SORT yourself at home. The idea here is that it's very, very basic. You pick 3 adjectives that best describe you, and then pick 3 adjectives that you wish you were like. If they match, then you're congruent. If not, then you're perhaps displaying incongruence. A very, very basic, crude, simple example of the Q-SORT assessment, but the full one will be available for you to complete. So at this point in the video, I would like you to pause. We'll soon end the video, and I'd like you to use some of the core features or the assumptions of the humanistic approach and apply them to Joyce. Don't just settle for one. Try and use a number of different assumptions of the approach to really analyse Joyce's behaviour here.